Oh, hey. Coming up. How are you, Simona? Good to hang. Hello, hello. Okay, cool. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Tom Cunningham. I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Energy Center here. On behalf of the Global Energy Center and the South Asia Center, I'm very pleased to welcome you all for today's discussion on bilateral energy and climate cooperation efforts between the United States and India. I took some notes here to sort of set the stage in terms of the scale of the issue that's before us. So just to set the scene. The role of non-OECD countries in the global economy and energy system is increasing, and their share of world primary energy has grown from 41% in 1980 to 60% in 2013, and is forecast to increase to 68% by 2040. Massive shift towards the developing side of the world. Fossil fuels supply just over 80% of non-OECD primary energy demand in 2013. And in India, which is 1/3 of the global population, it's the third largest economy in the world, and it has accounted for 10% of global energy demand growth since 2000. It is the world's third largest emitter and could be the #1 emitter by 2050. That seems daunting, but note that per capita energy demand is at least 7 times less. This is my own calculation, so maybe 7 times less than that of the United States. And 240 million of the 1.2 billion people in India lack access to energy. So the scale of the challenge here is huge, and the stakes could not be higher. Question then is, how does India surmount what Mr. Sivaram has called the paradox between economic development and clean energy deployment in India? And what is the role of the United States in this effort? Fortunately, we have a world-class group of experts and practitioners here today to lend their insights on these issues. I'm really excited to introduce each of them to you. First, we have John Morton. He's the Senior Director for Energy and Climate at the National Security Council, having assumed that role earlier this year. Prior to joining the White House team, John served as the Chief Operating Officer of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC. He's also previously held positions at the Pew Charitable Trusts, the Global Environment Fund, and the World Bank. We have Varun Sivaram. He's the Douglas Dillon Fellow and Acting Director of the Program on Energy Security and Climate Change at the Council on Foreign Relations. In addition to his work at CFR, Varun currently serves as an energy advisor to the Office of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He is also a member of the advisory boards for both the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the Stanford Precourt Institute for Energy. Nandan Nelvigi is a partner at White & Case in New York City and focuses on the development and financing of major energy and infrastructure projects. In addition, as the head of White & Case's global India practice, Nandan has extensive experience in cross-border mergers and acquisitions, joint venture, private equity, and other corporate transactions involving India. He is working with the State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources to provide financing tools in the U.S.-India Clean Energy Finance Task Force. Tanvi Madan, last but not least, is a fellow on the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, and she's the director of the India Project. Tanvi's work explores Indian foreign policy, focusing in particular on India's relations with China and the United States. She also researches the intersection between Indian energy policies and its foreign and security policies. So you see we have a great breadth of expertise to talk about what is a very holistic and broad issue. Once again, we're thrilled to have such a great group of experts, and as a final housekeeping note, I'd encourage you all to join the conversation on Twitter, where it is robust, I assure you, at AC Energy, and using the hashtag AC Energy. All right, John, why don't you kick it off? Explain a little bit the administration priorities and go from there.
Great. Thanks, Tom. And thanks, everyone, for being here. I see some familiar faces. That's always a little daunting when you look out and you see people who are smarter than you on the issue you're about to be speaking on. So I'll try to keep my remarks within my lane here. As Tom mentioned, I joined the White House about a year ago, just under a year ago now, to lead up the climate and energy account. And I think it's fair to say that for reasons that I'm sure are all bringing you here today to listen to this panel, the India relationship is absolutely key to the administration's priorities on both climate and energy for reasons that this panel will surely discuss and that I'm sure you know well. Well, let me just take us back a little bit, then focus on where we are now, and then look forward. So climate change and energy have emerged, as you all know, as a major strategic pillar of the U.S.-India relationship over the last 8 years. And our leaders have become very personally committed to increasing our collaboration on this issue. I think this dates back a ways, but certainly going back to 2009, U.S. and India collaboration was critical to getting the Copenhagen Accord across the line, which set in place many of the precursors to what we've seen most recently in the Paris Agreement. So many Americans have woken up to climate change in the form of the Paris Agreement, but really the precursors for that were laid back in 2009 in Copenhagen, and India-U.S. collaboration was very, very key to getting us to that point, and as a result, could be said was very key to getting us to where we are today. I think that accord really forged the basis for the bilateral relationship that we've had on climate since. That same year, back in 2009, the U.S. government announced a series of initiatives, and one in particular called PACE, the Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, which has since deployed billions of dollars for clean energy and supported hundreds and hundreds of megawatts of renewable energy deployment. And just as a personal aside, as Tom mentioned, I've seen on the ground how that actually works, both in my current position at the White House, but before that, when I was Chief of Staff and then Chief Operating Officer at OPIC, actually seeing significant deployment starting at a very, very small scale. The first independent power project in India was an OPIC-supported project back in 2010. It was a 2-megawatt project. It was a tiny little project. You look at it now and you think, my God, what is this? At the time, it was a big deal, and it really became the basis of how India looked at IPPs and how private companies could come into that market, invest private capital on behalf of shared goals, make profit, become successful, and support a vision for India's clean energy future. So it was exciting to be part of that early transformation of how India was liberalizing its market. From 2010 to 2012, 2 of my early years at OPIC, we expanded our portfolio 100-fold in India. Largely in the energy sector, as India began to make a series of big sweeping reforms in the power sector. So I've seen the upside. I've also seen the limitations and barriers, which we'll discuss in a moment, and then I'm sure in the conversation. I think it's fair to say that the relationship on climate and energy, in particular on climate, has been taken to a new level with Prime Minister Modi. And the priority that he personally has placed on these issues, and the priority and the relationship that President Obama and Prime Minister Modi have forged on climate change in particular. The U.S.-India relationship was immensely consequential to the adoption of the Paris Agreement. There were debates, negotiations, backslaps, cajoling in the hallways of Paris, which helped us get to where we are today. And so while I think a lot of attention has been shown to the U.S.-China relationship, most recently with the joint joining of the Paris Agreement in Hangzhou last week, I guess now, time flies, India has been absolutely crucial to the progress that we've made in multilateral fora on the climate front. And so now, as a result of that effort, we have a first comprehensive international framework for addressing climate change. And our leaders have met multiple times this year alone, not just at the state visit on June 7th, but many other times. And climate change has featured prominently and at some points centrally in those conversations. So why is this important? Beyond the obvious reasons. So India has put forward, as you know, some of the most aggressive and ambitious renewable energy targets in the world. And I would say, as a former clean tech investor and as hopefully a future clean tech investor and clean energy investor, I look at India and I see the most exciting, dynamic renewable energy market in the world. It's being held back by a number of things, but it is inarguably, in terms of its goals, objectives, public goals, and commitment that its leadership has shown, it is the most exciting market. So the question for us as an administration and for future administrations is, how do you unlock that potential? How do you drive more private capital more quickly on behalf of goals that now India has embraced publicly? And that is an effort that we focus on daily, that many folks on this panel focus on daily, and one that I hope occupies some of your time and attention as well. Because the key to climate change is unlocking private capital flows into India. I would say in the top 3 things that we can do to solve or to address our climate challenge. So over the past several years, this administration has launched a number of partnerships. I won't go into all of them, but there were, leading up to the June visit, we were excited to be able to put on the table a couple of new and innovative partnerships, public-private partnerships, all of them using philanthropic capital in some case, where environmentally leaning U.S. foundations are increasingly taking an interest not just in convening meetings and addressing, highlighting problems, but really putting their capital to bear in positions that can leverage private capital. So I'll just highlight the Hewlett Foundation, the Packard Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, have all put tens of millions of dollars on the table to help drive private capital into addressing India's clean energy issues. Project preparation facilities, first loss investment vehicles, new and innovative structures where traditionally government has played a role, but increasingly philanthropic capital is stepping in. And I think that heralds an increasingly good trend of concessional capital coming from unusual places to address issues that before had been the domain simply of governments. And I'm happy to go into more details during the Q&A if there's interest in that. I think that one of the things that we historically in climate talks have been, we've been adversaries often, not we in India, but developed countries and developing countries. And I think one of the exciting things about the US-India partnership now is that it is increasingly that. It is US companies and US investors looking at India as an opportunity, and Indian government looking at US capital as something to be attracted. And the clean energy, the number of issues that we have, the number of initiatives and partnerships that we have put forward to address that issue, I think speak to that partnership. So the Clean Energy Finance Task Force, the Clean Energy Investment Roundtable, climate finance discussions that we now convene on a regular basis, the strategic and commercial dialogue that we host with India on an annual basis, are all fora now where we sit down with Indian leadership, identify enabling environment issues, barriers, hurdles, and discuss in a very targeted and open and transparent way what both sides can be doing to take forward steps and to improve the enabling environment. I will say that I think we have still a long way to go. So the challenges, the opportunities are clear. The challenges are also quite clear. And I think I'll just name a couple before concluding. If you think about the credibility of the contractual regime in India, the power purchase agreement structure, and the variability of the power purchase structure from state to state, that sends a very, very mixed message to investors. Fortunately, this is something that I think has been well recognized, and that we increasingly have convergence on between the Indian and American side on ways forward. Foreign exchange risk is always a big issue, off-taker risk, and treatment of non-Indian banks. If you look at a lot of the big lenders that are trying to lend into the market, many of them are often significantly handicapped vis-a-vis their Indian counterparts. So I would say that the private sector right now, the US private sector in particular, is waiting to move, moving slowly, looking for signals, regular signals from the Indian government that the Indian government is committed to reform. I think we're positively inclined to what we are seeing, and we're committed to continuing to work with the government. I'll say one more thing here before turning it over. We have 3 large remaining climate change priorities for the remainder of this administration. The first is to see the Paris Agreement enter into force, which occurs when 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions formally join the accord. We are very, very close, and India will play an important role in that. And India has said very publicly that they are doing what they can to join the agreement this year. So we're working with India to try to ensure that that happens. The second is that we're pushing for a major amendment to the Montreal Protocol to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons. India is a critical player in that conversation. They have publicly committed to a successful outcome in the Montreal Protocol discussions that will occur in mid-October, and that is another extraordinarily high priority for us this year, where we are working with the Indians on a daily basis to make sure that we get that agreement. And the third is an agreement through the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, and it's an agreement to phase down the growth of airline emissions starting in 2020. It's the largest sector of emission growth in the world at the moment, and India, as a major and growing international civil aviation sector, is a country who we need to be working with constructively in those discussions, and are. So I'll highlight those three things, and if there are any questions later, happy to answer them. Continuing daily dialogue with the Indians on all three issues, and hopefully those will be three things that we can bring across the finish line in the final months of this administration, and really give President Modi the climate legacy that he, I think, richly deserves, and will continue on, hopefully, beyond this administration into the next. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, John. Varun, can you tell us about your views on India's capacity to meet these climate commitments and using renewable energy deployment, and your views on the role of the U.S. partnership to this end?
Yeah. To answer that question, I'll start with the story. A couple years back, when I first moved to DC and I joined the council, my first piece was about how India's recently announced 100 gigawatt of solar target. The target was 100 gigawatts by 2022. That target increased on 20 gigawatts, which was the previous government's target. I wrote that target was ludicrous. There was no way they'd achieve it. They weren't even going to achieve the 20 gigawatt target. Why increase to 100 gigawatts? And it was the first piece I wrote, and I felt very strongly about it. Now, two trips to India later, and a lot of Indian friends who have made fun of my article later, I'm ready to eat my hat, because it's clearly the case that India now is poised to eclipse that original 20 gigawatt target that we all thought was out of reach. And the 100 gigawatt target of solar that Prime Minister Modi announced after he came into office now looks a lot more like a stroke of genius. Because even if India does not get all the way up to that 100 gigawatts, which it may not, it will have accomplished more progress as a result of the ambition of that goal than any of us thought possible. So to answer your first question, what is India's capacity to accomplish these targets? And building off what John just said, I think India's got a tremendous capacity to surprise every analyst in the world in terms of what it can do on renewable energy deployment. In Paris last year, some colleagues at Stanford and I released this report, Reach for the Sun, which basically said solar power is India's most impressive and central commitment on climate, and achieving it is going to be central to achieving the rest of its INDC, its intended nationally determined contribution, that it announced ahead of Paris. I think John was annoyed with me because I made him read this on the plane ride back. And in the report, we argued that it's important to hit the headline number, 100 gigawatts of solar, but it's also important to make sure that within that headline number, there is a diversity of the solar that does get deployed. That if India is not only going to meet its climate goals, but also an assortment of domestic goals and benefits, from reducing air pollution to improving its energy security to reducing the unreliability of its electricity grid, it not only needs the enormous solar farms that it's been relatively successful at incentivizing, but also two other segments. Distributed solar power. This is solar power that's largely grid connected on rooftops in cities. And off-grid solar power that increases energy access for, you mentioned 240 million. The number I've heard is 400 million people that don't have reliable access to electricity, that may have fewer than 4 hours a day of electricity access. By the way, one other statistic that you mentioned was that Indians use on average 7 times less than the average American. The number I've heard is 10 times less per capita usage. So in this report, we say only by deploying these 3 disparate segments of solar can you actually achieve this assortment of domestic benefits. And it's important to get those domestic benefits because that's going to sustain the political coalition behind this ambitious solar target. Because if all you're doing is supporting your climate target, say with 100 gigawatts of large-scale solar, you're not going to be able to get the votes over the years to continue to re-up your targets. Within these 3, we found in this report that the utility scale segment is doing just fine. These are large solar farms. And India has committed to make 60 gigawatts of utility scale solar by 2022. We think they're largely on track for some or all of that target. There remain some challenges. Land acquisition is one of them. Another is the state of the electricity grid. That when you have a lot more solar than you have today, will your transmission and distribution infrastructure be able to deliver the electricity to the end user? But by and large, there's been a lot of progress on the utility scale solar, which makes up the vast majority of India's over 8 gigawatts of solar today. The second segment, distributed solar, is where we saw the least progress, or the biggest gap between commitment and reality. 40 gigawatts by 2022 is the commitment. More realistic targets put it at somewhere like 14. And still, there are significant hurdles to get to. Low availability of capital for the rooftop sector is a problem. Tied in with this is the unpredictable quality of installations. And there are policy problems. There's policy heterogeneity. Some states are capping the amount of distributed solar that can access the grid in a particular region. So there are problems to be overcome there. By the way, I'm going to conveniently cite the problems and leave them to Nandan to solve because he's the financing whiz. The last segment, very quickly, off-grid solar, also has its share of problems. The target is 3 gigawatts. And 3 gigawatts may seem like a low aggregate number, but in terms of the number of households that it could connect, it's enormous. If the government were to get anywhere near that number, they would have improved the energy access problem in India. Still, even more so than the distributed solar segment, off-grid faces these problems of unavailability of financing and non-bankability of projects. So this all said, solar is a very positive story. And solar is the biggest part of India's most impressive commitment at Paris, which was 40% of their power capacity by 2030 will come from non-fossil fuel sources. Okay? Solar is the biggest part of that. To give you some context, by 2030, India actually plans to deploy 250 gigawatts of solar. That is as much solar as was cumulatively installed around the world by the end of 2015. So India is going to put all of the solar that's already in the world in India by 2030. It's unbelievable. However, there is a bias in the international media, in India as well, to talk about solar and more broadly to talk about the supply side. Look, solar has limited capacity to solve what are India's rising emissions. Even by 2030, if they accomplish what they've set out to do, solar and wind together will compose less than 25% of India's power generation. This is generation and not capacity. And coal will continue to supply over a majority of India's electricity needs. That's why I think looking at the demand side is extremely important, and it's an understudied part of India's climate and clean energy challenges. Between now and 2040, India's demand for primary energy could increase by 2x, or it could increase by 4x, or somewhere in between. That's an enormous swing, and that's why we really need to focus on some of the initiatives that have been proposed by the Indian government, supported by the US government, but maybe get less press. This is things like smart cities and I think what John mentioned or was about to mention, their amazing progress on energy efficiency in the form of Energy Efficiency Services Limited. This is their public procurement agency that's reduced the price of light-emitting diodes now below 50 rupees per bulb. It's unbelievable what they've accomplished, and they're now setting out to solve air conditioners. So I think the demand side is as important as the supply side. Let me end with 3 recommendations for United States policymakers for the US-India clean energy and climate relationship. The first recommendation is, I think the biggest impact we can have, and maybe others will disagree with me here, I think the biggest impact we can have is not on deployment, but rather on research and development. And the particular brand of research and development I would point out is applied research and development. So I think that the United States has two programs, PACE-R and PACE-D. PACE-R focuses on science collaboration, and PACE-D focuses on deployment. I think we are missing a chunk, or we aren't emphasizing enough, a chunk in the middle, which is applied R&D that incrementally improves certain solutions for the Indian context. And this could be anything from solar panels that are dust-proof, solar cables that don't get chewed through by monkeys. This could be interconnection standards for Indian inverters so that they don't trip off when you have flickers in the grid. Solar thermal installations that allow you not only to generate electricity, but also refrigeration and filtered water. There are a lot of solutions we can get to very easily through incremental improvements to existing solutions that I think should be the focus of applied R&D cooperation between the United States and India. We could also, for example, direct United States research to respond to the procurement initiatives of agencies like EESL. If they want an air conditioner that's highly energy efficient under high ambient air temperatures, currently, the United States Renewable Energy Lab, National Renewable Energy Lab, does some work on this. And we could motivate even more US R&D to respond to these very targeted needs. The second recommendation I've got is don't score own goals on the relationship. I think John and the White House team has done a tremendous job. But there are certain things that we still do that raise eyebrows. So for example, we have this ongoing World Trade Organization dispute with India over solar domestic content requirements, Indian requirements that some proportion of solar panels be manufactured within India. Now, I've written on this on my blog. I think the United States is on solid legal footing in this case. But it is on very questionable diplomatic footing because this petition, the eventual WTO ruling, did absolutely nothing for United States producers. Most of the production of solar happens in China. And it has done a tremendous amount to hurt the US-India relationship. India today released a countersuit where it argued that, for example, Mississippi has domestic subsidies. And it's an own goal. I happen to think that India also scores some own goals on this. For example, my colleague Alyssa Ayers at CFR wrote a piece yesterday about why India's linkage of its Paris ratification to its bid to be part of the Nuclear Suppliers Group makes very little sense. India complains a lot that China gets a lot of the press. It was the 2014 US-China Clean Energy Agreement. It was the recent signing of the Paris Agreement between the United States and China. But India is doing itself no favors by keeping itself out of the headlines by restricting its, for example, its ability to ratify the Paris Agreement. Finally, the third recommendation I will make is that we do a ton of amazing stuff in our cooperation with India. We should be careful not to be too preachy and to be helpful. So I'm just back from a trip to India where I learned from several policymakers, they will remain unnamed, that it is helpful that the United States, for example, gives them recommendations for how to standardize their PPAs. This is a problem that John just brought up. But it's unhelpful that that happens to be delivered sometimes in a preachy way and in a way that says, look, you don't really know what you're doing. The Indians have put a lot of effort behind a policy framework that will effectively deploy clean energy. I think we should support it and we should laud it. And to date, we've done a very good job overall. And thank you to John and to this White House for making it a priority. So those are my recommendations for the US-India relationship. I will now leave it to Nandan to solve all of the intractable finance problems.
So Nandan, no pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And actually, I'm starting with John, took the thunder out of what I was going to say. And that's actually not disappointing. It's actually very heartening to know that somebody who's sitting in the administration has their eyes on the ball. And a couple of points that you made are absolutely the kind of things that the private sector needs to see happen in order to drive the capital to unlock the potential. And Varun, the challenges that you have set for me, the solutions are actually very simple. And these solutions are the same solutions that the private sector has been talking about, whether it is to unlock potential in the United States, to unlock potential in other countries, or it is in India, whether it is 20 years ago or whether it's today. The principles are very simple, and unfortunately, they are somewhat inflexible. And India needs to realize that some basic principles need to be achieved or adhered to in order to attract private capital. Starting with giving credit where credit is due. First of all, India's boldness in setting this bold objective, great objective, is really, really admirable. They are really moving the state machinery and putting in a lot of efforts and resources to try to achieve that. That's pretty unprecedented in India. There is a tremendous amount of political will at the top leadership to try to achieve these goals. The question, next step, is really about what kinds of concrete measures India puts into place, structural and tactical measures, in order to achieve these goals. So the devil is really in the detail. And in my job, I talk to the devil every day and I communicate with the devil. And to some extent, the effort that I've been involved in behind the scenes with the help of the State Department in communicating with the government of India is really some of these details. I kind of take the point that Varun made about not being preachy, but communicating it in a way that the delivery is going to be productive and constructive. Absolutely key point. And having done this over the last 22 odd years in India, one of the biggest challenges is in communicating what the private sector wants, what the US government wants, what the Indian government is willing to achieve, is willing to listen to, and how those messages are perceived. It's one of the biggest challenges, and it's very helpful to have various agencies of the US government involved in the middle to facilitate the process. It has to be a collaborative effort between the private sector and the government to communicate the message. As I was saying earlier, Tom, this is not an area where the government controls a lot of aspects that can bring about the change. This is not about great technology like in the defense sector or even in the nuclear sector. A lot of the technology is actually in the hands of the private sector. Private sector can go there and negotiate the terms on which it is willing to give the technology. The money, the capital really has to come from the private sector. That's in the hands of the private sector. All that the government needs to do is really facilitate that. Facilitate the dialogue, facilitate the movement of capital, facilitate the movement of technology. So what are the issues? And hopefully the solutions will follow. From India's perspective, again, the good news is a lot of the structural problems have largely been solved over the last 20 years. India didn't even have a basic electricity regulatory framework when it first opened up the sector to private sector way back in the early 90s. Since then, they have enacted new electricity law, amended it, reenacted it. Finally, India has a very good regulatory framework that can address a lot of the issues that the private sector is concerned about. So in setting up the landscape, the framework, the basic work has been done. People always complain about being able to enforce contracts in India, the slow pace at which the Indian courts move. Again, the Indian government, the current leadership, is already aware of these problems and are doing a number of things to change those. And it's a process. It'll take some time, but I think India is actually on top of these problems and will solve those problems. But the issues are, again, with the nitty-gritty details with respect to the electricity sector. So the first issue, which John touched on, is the credit of the off-takers. The one point, Varun, you and I should talk about offline is the point you made about how the utility scale sector is really on its way. That is actually a big surprise to me, because what I hear from all the investors, the lenders, the developers, is that it's a huge challenge. Most of the utility scale development in India is happening largely because of domestic developers, funding by domestic lenders, and a few domestic investors. It is not at a point where it is able to attract international lenders, international developers, and international equity investors. The domestic capital is actually adequate to move India along the slow pace at which they have been adding capacity, which is between 3 to 5 gigawatts per year. But in order to achieve 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022, 175 gigawatts of wind and solar and other renewable energy by 2022, you have to actually add 20 gigawatts of solar power per year. I don't see that happening with merely domestic capital and merely with domestic developers who are willing to take a lot of high risks at the very high risk hurdle that India sets for developers in India. The Indian developers will take that risk. Indian lenders have taken that risk and are suffering from huge amounts of bad debt in India right now. The big lending and local development that happened over the last 5 years are showing up in the balance sheets of a lot of the developers and the domestic lenders right now, and they have to clean up that house. Indian banks have the opportunity to actually diversify their risk by attracting international investors and international lenders. John made another point, which is discrimination against international lenders. That is just mind-boggling. Why they do that, is inexplicable. India needs that capital, but they openly say, we're going to treat you differently. We're not going to give you the same rights that we give the domestic lenders. That just doesn't make any sense. So credit is key issue for utility scale development, and it's also true for off-grid distributed energy as well. Fundamentally, if the people who are buying power and distributing it to the demand side do not have a good balance sheet, I don't see why anyone should sell power to them at commercial rates, period. So India has to really improve the credit. There are about 5 distribution companies in India that are profitable. The rest of the distribution companies are loss-making, are heavily indebted. There are new programs that Indian government has put into place, which actually could make a lot of difference, like the Uday program. It's a program where the Indian government has created incentives for the state governments to take the debt of the distribution companies off their balance sheet, put on the state's balance sheet where it should really belong, because the states own and control these distribution companies, and restructure the debt in the private market. It's a great idea. I think it'll go a long way in making a difference. But it is, by Indian government's own assessment, it'll take at least until 2019 by the time a majority of these distribution companies restructure their balance sheet. That's too late. For 2022, things need to be happening today, this year, and next year. So India needs to put in place some interim measures that will actually strengthen the balance sheets of these distribution companies. In the early 90s, India rolled out this fast-track power program where they decided to provide guarantees for 8 select power projects to attract foreign capital. But the way in which those guarantees were given, they were done through bilateral discussions. Those guarantees by the government became basically political lightning rods. And ultimately, those power projects went nowhere. But India needs to do something urgent, which is similar to what it did before, but in a more transparent, open method by which there is political buy-in to what government is doing, and go ahead and do that. What government is offering today by way of credit support is woefully inadequate, very unorthodox. Private sector doesn't recognize what they're offering. India simply needs to do what is widely recognized, basic, simple instruments to support the credit of these off-takers. Second point, standardization of documents. That seems like the kind of topic that nobody wants to talk about, pick up a cup of coffee and drink to stay awake, but that is enormously critical. Again, India can continue at its own slow pace of 3 to 5 gigawatts per year doing what it's doing today. But if it wants to scale up in a big way, has to really improve way in which the distribution companies are able to procure large-scale power across the country at a fast pace. They really have to improve the way in which risks are allocated, the way in which power purchase agreements and other contracts are adopted in these transactions. And India, again, recognizes this, and they're doing their best to move the needle on this front. Again, the solution is simply continue to do what you're doing, but do it faster and do it better. I think India could take help from a number of multilateral agencies like the Asian Development Bank, International Finance Corporation. Those organizations have their own advisory institutions. And I think they can come there, do it in a way that the US government cannot do, in a way that you don't look heavy-handed in the process, and take on an advisory role. And India, I think, is prepared to take that help, but that idea needs to be pushed forward much more aggressively. The third point is just the general nuisance with the foreign exchange regulations. Again, a point that John mentioned. India has an aversion to foreign debt capital. A lot of this emanates from the crisis that India went through in the early 90s with its foreign currency situation. But I think a lot of the regulations that India has right now with respect to that do more harm than good, and India, the Reserve Bank of India, needs to get rid of those regulations quickly.
Thanks a lot, Nandan. And Tanvi, can you zoom out a little bit and explain your views on how this cooperation fits into the broader US-India bilateral relationship, and expound on any regional geopolitical considerations that need to be factored in?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and to all of you. I'm going to do two things, kind of what Tom asked me to do. One is talk about where this interacts with the broader US-India relationship. And the second is kind of look at some of the global and regional implications potentially of in the US-India energy and climate change cooperation. The first thing I will say about, in terms of the broader US-India relationship, that this is interactive, that a better kind of broader strategic US-India relationship has facilitated cooperation in this area, and it works the other way around as well. It has become a cliche to say that the relationship is broader and deeper than ever before, a cliche that happens to be true. And energy and climate cooperation, I would argue, has been a key element of and contributor to that breadth and depth of the relationship. And not just kind of in the climate change and clean energy space, but also if you look at, I think, energy efficiency, which Varun already mentioned, where the US and India have been working together as well, electricity sector, and potentially on the smart grid side, oil and gas, and the other thing which we haven't talked about today, which is civil nuclear cooperation. Even more crucially, perhaps, if you think about kind of the cooperation in this sector, perhaps, is that energy and climate issues have gone from being seen as an irritant in the US-India relationship to a key area of cooperation. One where the Obama administration is seen as helping the Indian government achieve a key priority, sustainable growth. And the Modi government is seen as acting on what has been a key Obama administration policy. And indeed, I would say, along with the defense and security space, we'll look back and see this area as an area where there's been major forward progress in terms of the bilateral relationship. Cooperation in this sector has also helped change the narrative about each other. In the US, India was often seen as a spoiler when it came to a range of multilateral and global arena. India couldn't quite get from no to yes. And the traditional view in India was that there was an emphasis on the developed world holding India responsible for India and other developing countries for kind of forward movement on this. But in India, the kind of reverse was the reason it was not getting to yes is that it was the developed world that held responsibility and therefore needed to be the one to act. But we have seen kind of movement from that, and we've seen Prime Minister Modi and make the argument, and it's crucial because of the kind of political buy-in that's necessary, is make the argument that India needed to act not because the US or other countries were telling it to do so or that political pressure was being brought, but that because it was in Indian interest to take these actions. The other aspect of the narrative that this has helped kind of change, and I wouldn't, some of these narratives haven't changed completely, but it's helped move it along from India being a spoiler to being able to get to yes. And the second dimension being in India, the narrative was earlier, kind of in the Cold War, and especially the early years after, was that the US was a country that was blocking India's rise. Later on, you saw it as well. The US was making India's rise more difficult, including by seeking action in this arena, which India argued would slow down or make difficult its economic growth and development, which its government saw as very necessary and a key priority. And you've seen this again change more broadly, but in that the US is actually helping support India's rise as well as shape it. And in this arena, you see this as a narrative that has started to change in India, that the US is seen as more willing to help India and grow, and develop more cleanly, particularly thinking through some of the issues we've been talking about today, which is technology and finance. Let me just briefly kind of talk about, and I know we want to get to interactive discussion and your questions as well, but some of the geopolitical and regional aspects of this. The first is what it says about potentially India as a global actor. You did hear previously, you used to hear in previous years, something you used to hear about a decade ago from China as well, which is India is a poor developing country and needed time in terms of taking on global responsibility, so don't ask us to do anything just now on this. We'll work it out later. Our focus is going to be growth. You've seen a change in this rhetoric from India. You've seen a government now, particularly, that more actively seeks a global role, and it has been arguing that India has contributed, is contributing, and will contribute globally across a range of things. And you've seen them do this in different ways. Some of it is rhetoric, some of it is through actions. And one of the ways you've seen kind of this government is going to talk about highlighting Indian contributions in terms of men, material, and ideas, and not just now, but previously. So you've seen them, for example, highlight Indian contributions in terms of both world wars, in terms of, in more kind of the current space, peacekeeping cooperation, HADR, as well as evacuation operations regionally. They've also talked about and emphasized how India contributes to global economic growth through its own economic growth, but also as a source of labor and talent. And you've also, which is quite different from previously, heard them talk about their cultural contributions globally, particularly in terms of Buddhism and yoga. But you've also, in terms of Indian contributions, you're seeing them, and that India is going to be a global actor, but be different in terms of that, is kind of an emphasis on demonstrating that India can get to yes. And we've seen this. Where we haven't seen this yet is in terms of trade. WTO disputes on this is just one aspect of this, but trade is somewhere we haven't seen this yet. I would argue that's because of domestic political implications. But you have seen a change in Indian positions in this space on climate change, but also more broadly on cybersecurity and maritime security. And in this, you do see this is partly, it's been made possible, not just because, and the government does deserve credit in terms of the role it has taken to change these positions, but you've also seen this because the domestic debate in India has changed on these subjects, especially cybersecurity and climate change, which is why it is key on that domestic side in terms of the government's ability to deliver on these targets is to get buy-in on that side. A second kind of geopolitical and regional element is how this, and not just US-India cooperation, though I think this helps us along, and you've seen it in this space, is how this is changing the dynamic between India and the Middle East, which is between global oil and gas prices. US oil and gas coming on the market, and including LNG going from the US to India. You've seen this put India on the front foot in terms of giving it more leverage with almost all the countries in the Middle East. And this is really something that we will see how this develops over time, depending, of course, on oil prices, but it's already seen the dynamic. Down the line, if India's energy basket changes the way it would, it not just helps India become even less dependent on the Middle East, but it actually meets this broader strategic Indian goal, which then the US could help say they've helped India achieve as opposed to block, which is India becoming, not being so dependent on the world for these assets more broadly. Briefly, and I'll just kind of mention this because it does keep coming up, and I think Varun mentioned a little bit of this, as did John, which is how this plays into the US, India, China dynamic. It was very much as part of kind of the impression that India was seen as a spoiler. I think Indian policymakers were very aware that they were being seen in contrast, which is China seen as a constructive player, especially in the last few years on this, and got a reputational boost out of it, particularly with the US, whereas India was not. And while that's not the only thing that kind of drove this shift, it definitely did play a role. The other dynamic in this, and I think the discussion about the WTO side, which is interesting in that aspect, which is that China is going to be a player and therefore will be necessary despite everything else that's going on, because China will be a player in the power sector in India. Now, the opportunity for others is that India, at least for example, in the traditional power plant space, thought it had become too dependent on China. And therefore, one of where this has affected kind of US-India energy cooperation, including the disputes, has been that one of the reasons for those domestic sourcing requirements is this concern about all of it being imported from China, and the need to, over the long period, develop a domestic base. So India, again, going back to that concern about reliability on the world, and particularly other countries in terms of equipment. Finally, the US policymakers have said over time quite explicitly that India's rise is a good thing and that the US would support it. Less explicit in terms of the US-China-India dynamic has been that this democratic India is seen as a balance to China, as well as a contrasting model that democracy and development aren't mutually exclusive. And neither of those things is possible without a strong, prosperous India, and energy and climate change cooperation plays a key role in getting India to that point. So it really does help kind of this broader aspect. I won't talk about challenges because I think the panelists have highlighted it quite well. I think it would fundamentally come down to, which is something that is a challenge across the board in the relationship, which is the ability to deliver. But why it is important that they deliver in this sector, I would say, is because if there isn't progress in this, it will also affect negatively and shape negatively the broader US-India relationship. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all. This has been really, really interesting. I took a couple points of what I think might be the threads, and then I'll ask a couple questions and then open it up to the audience. But it sounds like the clean energy and climate cooperation has been an important and successful element of the bilateral relationship when it didn't always seem to be, or it began as an irritant. Now it's really central to meet not just the strategic broader goals of both countries, but also the common goal of economic development and of climate change adaptation and mitigation. The other, I think, a strong one is that India can and does exceed expectations. You know, I mean, the notion that ambition in itself is noble, for lack of a better word, because even if it's not met at that level, it's pushed the ball forward, it's created momentum, and we should all be prepared to be surprised that the scale is something is not impossible to be met. I think there's a strong point you said, which is there's a real need for the United States or for developed or OECD countries to not be too preachy, and there's an interesting interplay really between how these two this yin and yang, whatever part of this global economy, need to work together. How to get, there's a common goal there, but there's a way to need to do it as a real partnership where both sides have a stake and both sides are key players. And I think the last point is that the real work is on the private sector side, and governments need to work to unleash that, and the government commitment or presence may not be the actual driver, but it adds a huge layer of risk mitigation to make these kinds of things possible. Anyone can doubt or refute or answer any of the questions, but one question I have for any of you, but to what extent is the concrete steps that that John and Nandan have spoken to what extent is this just a near-term financing pathway? How do we get sustainability in this Indian power sector model, which is so big and complex, and where, as you mentioned, Nandan, there's not a lot of viability in the distribution companies, where I understand there's like 25% either structural or commercial loss in the system, a need for more reforms. So that's the first question. How much is all this work? How much more needs to be done? Is it enough? John, just throw it in. I'm going to drop it in your lap.
It's a big question. So I think, look, I'm a glass half full kind of guy, particularly when I look at a market as attractive as India. This is going back to some of the early things that I said, where you have an alignment of political will. All three of my co-panelists highlighted both the lack of will, both the presence of will and the presence of activities that recognize and that are proof that the barriers that we see are ones that need to be addressed. I think all of us think that those barriers need to be broken down faster and with more diligence and more speed. But I do think that we share a view that with respect to the biggest single problem, biggest single climate problem and biggest single economic opportunity, the government of India recognizes the limitations in its current structure. I would say that there is some element of being preachy that comes with the territory of highlighting again and again areas where reforms need to get made. That doesn't excuse bad diplomacy, but it does, I think, make you more open to calls of being the big ugly American in the room who's arguing for the same thing over and over again. I think that where this is slightly different from many diplomatic conversations is precisely in the role that the private sector plays in this. What we're trying here to do is not to, what we as a U.S. government and we as U.S. investors and companies are trying to do, is to support an Indian government objective. And the way we see best to do that is for the Indian government to make a series of reforms which they've recognized as important, which they've taken steps to address, but to expedite that reform process. And what do you get from that? You get private capital flows, not just coming from the US, but coming from other markets, which solves your capital problem, it solves your climate problem, it solves your, I'm being simplistic here, it solves your capital, your climate, and your economic development objectives all at once. So I think that in this case, we as an international community of people who care about climate have an imperative to be consistent, targeted, and dare I say from time to time preachy. And the more the Indian government is hearing it from players other than the U.S. government, the better, which I think they are. You've highlighted the need for this to come from the other international lenders, the IFCs, the Asian Development Bank, the bilateral development finance institutions of Europe, et cetera, because we all face the same issues and we all see the same opportunity. So I guess I didn't answer your question straight on, but I do feel like
That's your business.
yeah,
No, just kidding.
I do feel like we need to continue to push. I'm a glass half full kind of fellow, but I think we haven't seen quite the responsiveness yet that we need in order to help India meet its own goals. I share Nandan's feeling about I haven't seen us anywhere on track to get to those grid-connected gigawatt numbers that we hope to. So I think that's an area where we need to continue pushing, and that's a question of DISCOM reform, of off-taker support, and we'll continue pushing that in that area.
So I'll say, the three of us may be looking at the same data, 3 to 5 gigawatts of additions a year, and making different conclusions. Yours, Nandan, is, the financing and the international capital is not there to scale this up to the 20 per year that we need, and I am oxymoronically preparing to be surprised. Because I do see 3 to 5 gigawatts a year is a tremendous improvement over where we were 5 years ago. So I'll say in response to Nandan's original point, and John's, that we're not on track because there's a lack of foreign capital. There is some foreign capital. So in particular, one of the biggest bids was recently won by SoftBank. Capital coming out of Japan, and I think that the government policy that's probably most supported foreign developers and foreign capital has been their solar parks policy, where they prepare these large sites with transmission close by, land already graded, permitting ready to go, which plays well to a foreign developer who says, look, I've got these deep pockets with these foreign backers. I'm able to set up an installation quickly if you take me away from the messiness of how solar development would normally happen. And so I've actually observed this bifurcation of the foreign guys are willing to play in the solar park space, whereas the domestic guys want no part of it. They say there's a premium being charged to us for being in that solar park. We will go through the messy process of acquiring land and getting permits ourselves. So I think once we see a few successful solar park projects that are backed by foreign developers with foreign capital, I think there may be a demonstration effect there that says, hey, if you're a foreign player, you can do business here in India. So of the three of us, I may actually be the most glass half full on this. I will also say that on the flip side, there have been some messy failures of foreign capital. So for example, there was a lot of excitement in 2015 that the YieldCo was going to transform solar finance in India. This was a financial instrument that was going to bring capital from international capital markets. Retail investors could go and invest in a YieldCo's shares, and this YieldCo would bring low cost of capital money into India to build solar projects. Unfortunately, that model did not do very well for a variety of reasons, and then there were prominent failures like that of SunEdison, which had a long pipeline in India. So there have been some hiccups on the international front as well. End of the day, to answer your question, how does long-term sustainability come about? It comes about not with domestic lending and not with international financial institutions or the public sector. It comes about with the international private sector and with low-cost capital from international capital markets. And what John worked on before at OPIC was how can small amounts of public money help to leverage larger flows in the private sector.
Can I just
Go ahead.
on that one? Varun, the examples are great. Actually, I don't deny that there are a number of international players in the market, and there's no question, and we represent a number of them. The problem is about whether the reforms and the changes are going to be sustainable and are of a nature that it's going to bring about the scale at which they need to make the changes in order to achieve the targets. The individual examples, to some extent, are misleading. India draws big, beautiful, broad strokes, but then the short strokes are sometimes ugly. So in the early 90s, we have lots of examples of international developers, lenders, investors going into the country and getting out of the country afterwards with fingers and limbs burnt. And that's a bad situation. What I'm concerned about sustainability is, this problem that we've seen repeat over and over again of one step forward and two steps backward. When the investors got out of India, you talk to them, it's going to be very hard to stop them from shaking their heads when you talk to them about investing capital in India. So you fool me once, blame it on you, fool me twice. I have to blame myself. So the investors are not going to be fooled again and again. And so individual examples are not necessarily good enough. I think you need the systems, the processes, and the standards that will actually carry this through and make this sustainable. And you don't want too many unique cases. And people come in and look at SoftBank, and you don't want them to be asking, how did they get comfortable with this? And those questions are already coming up. The second and the third investor is not going to simply follow the lead. You need, for sustainability, you need good examples with people who have followed the principles and that can be adapted by others.
I'll just say that, this actually brings up one of the issues that I think is implicit. But that it is not just what's happening in this particular silo or stovepipe, but kind of especially what Nandan has been talking about, which is it's part of that broader set of kind of reforms, whether it's in terms of allowing financing to come in or regulation, et cetera. And it really will come down to not just on kind of the 30,000 foot, but the plumbing and whether that's going to be. And it seems that the government does recognize. The question is also one of time. Which is to meet these targets in the time required, because the government really is going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time, and it's not quite clear whether at the moment it has kind of the capacity to do all of these things, especially thinking about these things across these different silos. I would just say on preachiness, one of the shared values that the US and India have is preachiness on both sides. The question is, and I think there's already been improvement in terms of getting from it being seen as hectoring to a constructive conversation.
Fascinating. All right, let's open up to questions. And just raise your hand. We've got a couple runners or walkers with mics who can come to you. Let's see. You were the first one, sir.
Hi, Dave Ramaswamy, Indus Latin Ventures. One of the shared threats besides climate change for US and India is international terrorism. The 15th anniversary of 9/11, reports have come out saying the problem has gotten worse. And since 2001, there's Al-Qaeda and ISIS in at least 20, 25 countries. And the funding for all of them have come from diversion of Middle East oil sales. Now the US is the Saudi Arabia of oil. I mean, we are the world's biggest oil producer. But India imports 80% of its oil from the Middle East. So going forward, the question is, what's the opportunity for India and the US, or at least for the US, to assist India in transferring technology for clean fuels? So beyond just LNG and CNG, but next generation cellulosic ethanol, algal fuels, and things of that nature. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great question. But I don't think we should skip over CNG and LNG just so fast. One of the things I forgot to mention was I think India has neglected the tremendous opportunity in natural gas. Yeah. And it should be a core component of its climate and clean energy strategy. Today natural gas is 8% of India's either primary energy demand or electricity demand. It should be a whole lot more. Natural gas can enable greater penetration of renewable energy. It can also serve varied sectors from fertilizer to industry to even transportation through CNG. And international prices for LNG are cheaper than ever. And right now is a great opportunity for India to invest in regasification terminals and a domestic pipeline network to take advantage of a fuel that's half as carbon intensive as coal. Your broader question about how can the United States help India get off of oil? I'm not sure the answer to that is we can transfer to them clean alternative fuels, because we don't have them. We have been trying to, through our renewable fuel standard, increase the uptake of cellulosic ethanol, and it hasn't gone very well for us. I don't think we're in any position to go and transfer it to India. There are some great things, though, that India can do to reduce its exposure to international oil markets, and one of the biggest ones is continuing to reduce its consumer fuel subsidies. India, as you know, prior to Prime Minister Modi's entry, subsidized every fuel under the sun, from diesel to kerosene to liquefied petroleum gas. It liberalized those diesel subsidies. They're gone. And that was a tremendous step. However, moving forward, India does need to liberalize the rest of its subsidies. And it may or may not have been one of the many countries in the recent G20 summit that did not enable a stronger statement than the one made in 2009 that all we'll do is phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies over the medium term.
Hey, you're not an administration official. You can actually say more than that if you want.
Well, but I will say, Varun, I mean, one of the things on that is you're not going to see a blanket change in that. You will see a move towards a more targeted subsidy system. And you will particularly not see something on that in the next few years where India will have over a dozen states go to elections and then have a general election. So I think you're going to see it move to a targeted subsidy model. And even I think the previous government started to move, because you cannot do it in one go. And so it already started removing subsidies slowly, month by month, and kind of deregulating prices month by month rather than do it in one big go. I'll say this broadly on India's already reduced how much. So at the moment, India gets about 66%, not 80%, which it used to from the Middle East. Because it recognizes that it needs to have a more diversified set of suppliers. US gas has really helped, not just directly in terms of gas, LNG going, but in terms of what it's done to the global prices, but also what it's done to India's negotiating ability with other suppliers as well. So you've seen it already help. I think you've already seen and you've heard a number of panelists talk about what the US and India are doing together that down the line will help even broadly kind of how much India is working on. And also the Petroleum and Natural Gas Minister who was in town recently talked a lot about not just kind of gas in terms of the resource coming in, but the infrastructure being put in place. Again, we need to see that it actually gets implemented, but it is something that they recognize that they're going to need to focus on.
Thanks. All right, let's try to take actually 3 questions in one go. Don't forget to say your name and your affiliation. You, ma'am, right in the middle. And then you, sir. And then you, please.
Hi, it's Emily Meredith from Energy Intelligence. And John, I was wondering, since Varun touched on the issue of the nuclear supplier group linkage to Paris ratification, and you said Paris ratification was one of the big priorities for the president by the end of the year, if you could talk about how optimistic you are for that hurdle being overcome, either through D-Link. Yeah.
Great. Next question, please. And we'll just take all the answers together.
Jack Warner with Climate Institute and also affiliated with ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. Just on that point, when you were talking about reliability of installers and so forth, ANSI has opened up a very good cooperative effort with India with their standards groups and doing work in that area. Last week at the Asian Development Bank, there was a lot of discussion about the IAEB and whether or not there was going to be a role for that new bank that China's set up to be involved in all of this activity, and also about how they're also involved in financing coal projects in both India and China. Supposedly ADB is not doing anything in China. They are financing coal plant projects in India. And they also said that the U.S. is not willing to get involved in the IAEB at this point, at least the U.S. representative at the meeting yesterday. So just wanted to bring that out and see what you thought about that bank that's been put in place by China and what role it might play in terms of bringing more financing into the arena here.
Good question. And you, sir?
Richard Lee Smith. I'm at the British Embassy where I look at US-India relations. I'm also a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. You seem very positive about the top leadership ambition, potential here, but can I ask you to be even more specific about the stakeholders that oppose this progress here, or is it other barriers that I'm not quite getting? Is it capacity of the policymakers? Is it political time? What's really holding back the changes that need to be made to meet such ambitious goals? Thanks.
Thanks. So the questions are, 1, Paris ratification by India, 2, Asia, the AIIB, that bank's role in this process, and 3rd, what about the opponents or what's holding it back? Why not more progress?
So I'll take the first and then just dabble for 20 seconds in the second, and then allow others to go in more detail. On the first, Emily, thanks for your question. The Paris Agreement, as I mentioned earlier, goes into force when 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions formally join the agreement. Why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because when that happens, the agreement enters into force. It has legal standing as much as any other international agreement does, and it commits countries to the reduction pathways that they have committed to. That's important. A year ago, it was thought that it would take until 2018 or 2019 for the agreement to actually enter into force. And there's a lot of things that can happen between now and 2018 or 2019. You can lose momentum, priorities shift, hard-fought negotiations over terms and conditions can be reopened. So we are very, very committed to seeing this enter into force as soon as possible this year, and that was a real objective of this administration. I think we're feeling pretty confident that we'll get there. There's a big event on the 21st next week at UNGA that the UN Secretary General is hosting. That'll be the next big inflection point where we'll see I was going to use the word a flood, a number of new countries come and publicly commit themselves to the agreement. So I would say we're pretty optimistic about our chances this year. India may or may not be essential to seeing the agreement come into force. There's a lot of other countries that are unexpectedly expediting their domestic procedures and moving forward. India accounts for 4.1% of global emissions. If you look at the charts that the data was based on from about 8 years ago when these numbers were locked in, they actually account for more than that now. But at the time, they're 4.1%, so it's a big deal. But we're definitely pushing them. They're pushing themselves, and we're optimistic that we'll get there with or without them, although better with them for sure. Quickly on the second question, I would just flag, without getting into the AIIB and the administration's position on it, I would say that I think for people who care about climate change and financial flows, the question of how China uses its domestic capital in overseas markets to support coal projects is one that we should all remain very attentive to. They've made public commitments standing alongside us in joint statements at the leader level that they will take steps to strictly control their finance for overseas high emissions projects. We haven't seen as much action as we would like on that front, and it's an area that we will continue, but the next administration is certainly going to have to take up, both within the context of the AIIB and the other EXIM equivalents of China's financing structures.
Anyone else?
Sure. Did either of you want to?
I was just on the AIIB point. I mean, India is the second largest shareholder. You've already seen talks about what kind of projects. I suspect on the kind of high emissions, potentially coal, it'll happen more with other types of financing rather than on the AIIB side, just because of the sheer number of countries involved. But you've also seen some of the initial projects. The first one, which is AIIB and ADB co-funded, which is in Pakistan. It's a power plant, and so I suspect you will see it being used as a source. But I think even other countries involved recognize that you want to keep in mind certain standards on this. And it's actually been more productive, from what I hear, a conversation than people would have otherwise expected, more because their own priorities rather than anything else on that front. I will say this, on the coal side, I think there needs to be a recognition here that whether the US likes it or not, and whether the administration likes it or not, coal is going to be part of India's energy mix. The question is, how do you ensure that it is used in the best way possible? And how yes, there'll be an exit ramp, try to make it a smaller part of India's energy mix, but it is going to be unrealistic in the short to medium term to expect India to move away from that entirely. So whether it gets the financing, where it gets the financing from is going to be a question. If it doesn't come from here and the kind of R&D that goes into newer projects, it will come from elsewhere.
Yeah, and recognizing that, I think it's an open question whether it's a good idea to finance supercritical and ultimately ultra supercritical coal power plants that are considerably more efficient than the subcritical plants that compose a vast majority of India's coal fleet today. I don't think that question of whether to finance those plants should be dismissed out of hand. I don't think we adequately answered the last question, who opposes this sort of... I'll recast it to say, irrespective of strong central government support, the real implementers at the end of the day are the states. And so, for example, the government recently came out, the central government recently came out with these RPOs, Renewable Portfolio Obligations, that commit states to achieve first 2, then 5, then 7 or 8% of their power from solar power over the next few years. And at the end of the day, like, that is going to be up to the states to determine whether they're going to comply with. And to date, they have not complied with these RPOs, and there's no reason to believe that they will in the future unless a stronger carrot and stick approach is taken by the central government. So I think at the end of the day, it'll come down to whether the states want to implement these policies that are emanations of a grand central vision.
Last word, Nandan.
On the AIIB question, I don't know whether that is a decision that's in the hand of the government. Again, if the private sector developers decide to go and take the money from AIIB, I don't know if the government of India is actually can or will step in and say, don't take that money. It may be a different calculation for the government of India to actually step in and say so, but I doubt it, given that they are one of the biggest shareholders of AIIB. If the Chinese money, Chinese Development Bank money is already coming into India for a number of projects. India needs capital, and they'll take that capital from whatever source they get it. That's my guess. With respect to the third question, right now the cost of supply of power is much higher than the price at which the electricity is being sold to the consumers. So that's where the constituency is. It's a lot of the agricultural sector, a lot of the farmers, and big chunk of the vote bank for the politicians depend on this cheap power coming from the state-owned distribution companies. And that's the biggest challenge right now. And I think that a lot of the state governments who do control these distribution companies are under the control of the politicians, and they're having a hard time pulling back these subsidies. The real answer is really the government needs to get out of this business of distributing power to the people, and they need to privatize it so that they can run the distribution business on basic commercial principles.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time. One last thought on my end is that this, it's very glass half full, but given the need for success or the kind of relationship that the U.S. and India are plugging away at in terms of clean energy and climate, I think has a lot of great benefits and has a lot of good will come of it. But also it is, I think, needs to be successful, not just on its own terms, but also to be a model for kind of the development between different parts of the world to help everyone meet their climate goals, help everyone advance their economic development, and also to allow the private sector and government to work together in the most efficient way possible. So it's also exciting to look about it as a template for use elsewhere. I want to thank all of our panelists, a great diverse group, real expertise, and all of you for coming. Appreciate it, and thanks again.